Good morning, everybody. I see that numbers are still increasing, so we give at least another 5 minutes for participants to join us. Looking forward to reconnect with you in 5 minutes.
Good morning, Julia. Just to report in, this is Hubert from Nairobi. Want to check if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Excellent.
And you should then also be able to switch on the camera when it is your turn.
All right, we'll do so. Where's the camera? Here. Can we move the camera? Yeah, can we center it?
Yeah, let's move it. If we push it to...
This is the one?
Yes.
Okay, so I suggest we start now. We have a good number of over 200 participants and increasing. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the launch webinar of the Resilient School and Disaster Risk Reduction Education course, which we are launching and we are starting today. Disaster risk management and disaster risk reduction education is gaining in importance worldwide, but also particularly in our region, in the Southern African region. This is due to climate change, which induces disasters as, for example, the cyclones. We have seen the very painful experience of the cyclone Idai. Of course, also so-called nature disasters such as COVID, and social disasters, including conflicts, as we can unfortunately currently witness in the north of Mozambique. The overall aim of this MOOC, massive online course, is to strengthen the preparedness, the mitigation, recovery, and response capacities of the education sectors. And then, of course, also of the community at large. We will see that in the presentation of the course, that the aim is really to look at the education system and the whole education community in a large and systemic way. And that we try to do through the risk reduction education, school disaster management, and making sure that school facilities are also safe. So the course will introduce you, among others, to the systemic nature of risks, which is based on that interaction of social and natural risks, the linkages between disaster risk reduction education, education for sustainable development, and climate change education. Will introduce you also to the concept of the comprehensive school safety framework, to the so-called VICES method, which is a multi-hazard assessment method of schools, localities, and infrastructures, and to planning for education in emergencies. And I have the honor to introduce you to our two speakers today. We have a relatively short webinar because the idea is really to, with the quick introductions, guide you on, hint you to the course website, and hope that many of you will be encouraged to enroll. We already have a great number. It was last week, we had over 600 people registered already, but the number can be endlessly large. So we encourage you to go to the website after this webinar. So I'm introducing you to Professor Hubert Gaysen, who is since 2 weeks the director of the UNESCO office in Eastern Africa, based in Nairobi, but he's fortunately also still the director of the office where I'm based in the regional office for Southern Africa, based in Harare. And his introductory remarks will be followed by a presentation of the course by Dr. Jair Torres, who has worked for many, many years with UNESCO on disaster risk reduction in general, but then in education also in particular. And he will provide us with an overview on the course. And without any further ado, I'm now handing over to Professor Gaysen.
Yeah, thank you, Julia, and a very good morning. Good to see you. Dear colleagues and friends, greetings from the UNESCO regional offices for Eastern and also the office for Southern Africa. A very good morning and welcome to all connected to this launch webinar for the online course on resilient schools and disaster risk reduction education. The number and the impact of disasters is growing at an alarming rate, as we know, and that is also so in the Southern Africa region. According to the Global Climate Risk Index of 2021, which is developed by the German Watch, the countries most affected by extreme weather events as a result of global warming in the year 2019 were indeed Mozambique, Zimbabwe, as well as the Bahamas. So you see, 2 of the 3 countries listed here are in the Southern Africa region, in the SADC region. Disasters happen in many forms, and indeed, most of them are climate change induced. But last year, the world also witnessed an entirely different type of disaster in the form of a virus called COVID-19. And that evolved as a pandemic, which basically paralyzed education systems all over the world, also here in the Southern Africa region. For decades, the United Nations, together with development partners and member states, have joined hands to combat poverty and to embark on a path to its sustainable development. And we have worked on that for decades. Conflict and natural disasters were viewed, however, as major obstacles in achieving the goals that we set ourselves every time in a particular period. And the more recent period was the MDGs. You will remember the Millennium Development Goals with a target date towards 2015. And conflict and natural disasters were really viewed as a major obstacle in achieving the MDGs. And this was certainly also the case for MDG 2, which aimed at achieving universal primary education. We therefore need to draw lessons from this to ensure that we avoid similar setbacks for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I particularly focus now on the SDG 4 on quality education by 2030. So this calls for better preparedness, stronger resilience building in the wider education sector. And strengthening disaster preparedness in general, and for the education sector in particular, and to provide adequate and also to provide adequate training on the vulnerability assessment tools to prevent, to mitigate the impact of these disasters, therefore becomes a key priority. Now, UNESCO's work on education for disaster risk reduction and preparedness aims to build capacities to use education as a means to prepare for disaster risks and therefore to mitigate their impacts. UNESCO strongly advocates for a conceptual shift in the thinking and in the action, which is a shift away from merely post-disaster response towards now pre-disaster preparedness and action. As we all know, and when we go to see the dentist, they will tell you prevention is better than cure, or the medical doctor, prevention is better than cure. And we all have internalized that concept. But looking at the way we have dealt with disasters over the past decades, it is urgent that we make this shift also in the education sector and beyond. We need to make that shift in all the work that the UN is doing, a shift much more towards prevention and preparedness, rather than waiting for the next big bang and then struggling again with humanitarian responses, with build recovery and rebuild responses, which are, of course, terribly expensive. So also in the education sector, we advocate for this shift. And this will not only be much more cost effective, it will also save lives and infrastructure at the same time. And therefore, this must be the way forward, prevention and preparedness. Now, recognizing that both education and science, technology and innovation are central to building society's resilience to hazards, UNESCO is engaged in strengthening disaster risk management through resilient schools and disaster risk reduction education. By operating at the interface between sorry, my auto cue is blocked. But let me then just say that UNESCO operates really at the interface between the education, the sciences, the culture, and also the important communication and information mandate. It puts UNESCO in a unique position to address this transition from response, disaster risk response, towards prevention and preparedness. On that last mandate, communication and information, we have seen on several occasions when disaster strikes that this function is so important. And in a recent initiative that we have taken in post-disaster EDI, we are, for instance, building capacities and infrastructure for community radio, which will help communities to be better prepared, but also inform each other when disaster is on its way, to be prepared, to seek shelter, and to reduce the impact of a particular disaster when it happens. So I'm very happy we are launching this MOOC today. This is available free of charge. It means also it has a large access for many learners. And I really hope that many learners in the education system will go through the curriculum, will take the knowledge offered in this program and translate that into your own environment, into your own job, and into your own schools. So we really look forward to work with you, with all of you. And we hope that this training program will be of much use to your education systems in your countries in the Southern Africa region. And we are also eager to learn the lessons from this and see how can we bring this to other regions in Africa and beyond. So with these words, let me wish you a most successful launch of this MOOC curriculum. And I hope many of you will engage. Thank you very much and have a very successful webinar. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, Hubert. And I would encourage colleagues to please put questions either in the question and answers or the chat. And I hope, depending a little bit on how long Chaya is taking for his presentation. We might have a couple of minutes also for direct questions and answers. So I'm now handing over to Jair Torres, Dr. Jair Torres, who will give us a more detailed insight in the MOOC. Over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Professor Gichen, for your very nice introductory remarks. As you have said, that the context is, for me, is going to be easier to start discussing why school safety is important, and not only why it's important in the African region. So I'm gonna develop a small presentation, setting in the context and explaining a little bit about the objectives that we're gonna be discussing during the course, the different models, and some key elements in order to let you know what we're gonna be discussing during the 8 weeks MOOC that we are launching today. So let me just, I'm gonna start sharing my screen like that we can see the presentation. Just let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it well.
Okay, so first of all, thank you everybody, and thank you for all of those that has been already registered to the course. We are very excited to launch this course today, and we are very excited to share this knowledge with you, and also learning from all of the people that has been registered in this MOOC. Is going to be a two-way learning process for us, because we're going to get a better idea about what is happening in your own local context or national context, and for you, because we're going to start sharing some ideas about how the concept of resilience schools and disaster risk reduction education has evolved since many years, and how these conceptions that we have around education and disaster risk reduction, and also of resilience, has been evolved since many years. You know, since many years ago, we were believing that disasters that were issues such as natural disasters. Nowadays, to talk about natural disasters is something that is out of mind. You know, we know now that disasters are social constructions, and the only thing that is natural are the hazards. So for instance, these are some of the elements that we want to discuss during the course. So why this course is very important for the African country? As you know, hazards has been very recurring in the African region. Professor Hubert has just mentioned about all the climate related hazards that has happened there. We have many of cyclones, Cyclone Ida. We have some earthquakes, even if it's not a very seismic region, maybe at the north. We have a lot of droughts, and we have a lot of societal hazards that are very important, because before Sendai, disaster risk reduction was seen only as a natural hazards or socio-natural hazards approach. But since Sendai, we have integrated conflict and societal hazards as part of the need for be discussing on school safety. Just to give you an example, on Africa, between the year 2000 until the year 2010, we calculate more or less the losses in around 27 billion, which represent only the 1% of the total losses in the world. Nevertheless, the context of the African region is very particular, because it is believed that only 30% of all of disasters that are happening in Africa are being reported. We have a lack of reporting on what is happening in the African region. So this is why we believe that this amount that we have been calculated for the damage and losses in the African region is not very well representing the real reality of what is happening there. Similarly, if we check the top 10 countries in Africa that are affected by disasters per 100,000 inhabitants in the last 20 years, 6 of the top 10 are in Africa, having Ethiopia as one of the major African countries to be affected. The population was affected, with more than 46 million people affected during the last 20 years. So this is something that is very important, because as we're gonna see during the whole MOOC, natural hazards, socio-natural hazards, and societal hazards are affecting the education systems, are affecting the learning process of children, are affecting teachers and administrative staff, but in general is affecting the whole society, because having issues on the education sector diminish, as we're gonna see on Module 1, the possibility of a country to really get out of the trap of underdevelopment. So this is something that we're gonna be discussing during the MOOC. Just to give you some specific data concerning previous disasters, and this is only reporting some of the natural and socio-natural disasters that we had in Africa. In 2010, we have an earthquake in Algeria where more than 122 schools had to be rebuilt and where 1,800 schools were really damaged. They estimate the losses of more than $70 million in order to put the schools back in operation. And there is a lot of evidence that shows that one of these issues were related to the poor quality of construction and also to the lack of quality when the constructions were being done. We have issues of fire in Uganda, for instance. Some children has died in dormitory schools. We have issues of cyclones, like Cyclone Joanna in 2012, and the more recent in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. We have issues of floods, where thousands of schools buildings has been destroyed. We have issues of landslides that has been affected many schools, for instance, in Sierra Leone. High winds, the case of Ghana, where some schools has collapsed. In Sudan, also floods, where some students have died. But also we have something that has become very, very usual in the last 20 years. There are some buildings that has been collapsed without being triggered by any specific natural hazards. And that was the case for South Africa, Nigeria, or Kenya, where many kids has been died, not because it was an earthquake, not because it was a cyclone, but due to the lack of maintenance of the schools. So this is very important because, as we mentioned at the beginning, disasters are social constructions, and we are not waiting only for the natural hazard to impact the schools, but we see that the lack of maintenance, what we call as ordinary use, can create some issues of vulnerability to the buildings, but also to the persons that can produce that kids will not be safe. And not only kids, but also the whole educational community. And as Professor Huber was mentioning, last year and still this year, there are many African countries, and we can say that all that has been affected because of the COVID, due to the school closures that has interrupted the education services, but also because they have been, other kind of traumas that has been affected the learning processes of the kids. Parents that has been died, grandpas that has been died, friends that has been died, and that has produced a little bit of distress to kids and, delays the educational processes. So this is something that we have to take into consideration in order that when we are planning school safety. So giving you this small overview about the context that we are facing nowadays, I'm just going to give you now an overview about what is this massive open online course is trying to discuss. So education, as all of you know, and I guess that we are all together today because we are convinced that education is central to build societies' resilience to hazards, but also to build, in general, peace societies that are in line with sustainable development, that are in line with the adaptation processes that we need to follow, that are in line with the resilience process that we want to build. And hazards such as floods, earthquakes, became disasters when society lacks the ability to cope with them. So as I was mentioned at the beginning, it's something that we're going to be very reiterative. The issue are not the natural hazards. We are living in a planet that is in continuous evolution. The issue is about how, as a society, we manage to coordinate each other, to work together, to work between different sectors in order to avoid the negative impacts of these natural hazards that are the normal evolution of the planet that sometimes is being, modified by the anthropogenic issues, so by the influence of men and women on the planet, like climate change, like fracking, etc., etc. And all of these natural hazards, when they became disasters or societal hazards, including technological hazards, etc., when they became disasters, we have been realizing, and the statistics show that disaster has a major impact on children and youth. And this is a big problem because children are considered one of the vulnerable groups nowadays. Normally, when a disaster strikes, more than 50 to 60% of the people that suffer from that disasters are children. And this is something that, brings a little bit, puts a lot of attention on the areas that we are discussing. And as we mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has has revealed the systemic nature of risk. You know, something that before we didn't see very clear, you know, how all these cascade effects. So something that happened in China that was related to a biological hazard managed to affect the education service in countries in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific. So how a specific event that is not in general or cannot be related to a specific context can affect in a way all the different elements, because we live in a world that is really interconnected, and we need to check for this specific risk that could be systemic and that can affect our societies, and not only the education service and the education systems in all of the countries. And as Professor Hubert was mentioned, climate change is becoming more and more and more affecting societies. We saw last week what is happening in Canada, in Vancouver, temperatures of 49.6 degrees, something that has never been recorded before. So climate change is here, is something on which one humans has a lot to do with that. So education needs to serve as well in order to change the way how we are creating and shaping our societies in order to cope with climate change and to try to fulfill those commitments that we have agreed, for instance, on the Paris Agreement, and avoiding that the natural hazards, the normal evolutions of the planet became more intensity in intensity and in frequency and affect higher our countries. And just to say, and this is something that we believe all, the education sector has a key role to play in addressing this challenge and preventing hazards from becoming disasters. And this role is best fulfilled through resilient schools and disaster risk reduction education. So this is why we are launching this MOOC today with the colleagues of UNESCO. So what is going to be the aim and objectives of this MOOC? The first one is to really strengthen the understanding of resilience schools and education in the context of systemic risk. So how, and linking to one of the priorities of the Sendai framework, how we understand the risk, and how we understand the risk that the schools are facing and the education is facing in this specific context of, that I was mentioned before, of systemic risk, on these areas where we have blind angles and then we don't see from where the risk can come. So this is important for us to understand the context and to try to plan for that specific issues. The second objective is to increase the capacity of policymakers and planners to integrate disaster risk reduction in their national education policies and plans. And not only to integrate disaster risk reduction on national education policies and plans, but to influence on other policies that are important in order to align to the general objectives of countries. For instance, on the National Development Plan, on the National Adaptation Plan, how we place education as an important issue to create resilient societies, but also how within the education sector, we position the school safety agenda in order that has a more prominent role within the whole planning of the education sector and in the whole planning of governments and countries. So this is very important, that we try to increase the capacities for policymakers and people that are working on school safety issues to better discuss and position their topic within the Ministry of Education, but also within the whole government and within the other sectors, because we want to see that we need partnership with other sectors if we want to secure school safety. Then the third objective is to improve the resilience of learning facilities. So it's trying to understand why the science that is behind school safety is important. Why it's important to have good buildings, good regulation, to understand what are the hazards that affected the school. So are my school exposed and my education system exposed, in order to improve the resilience of those learning facilities. Why maintenance is important, how we can involve the community on securing learning facilities, and how they can be audits of these learning facilities. The fourth objective is to enhance the capacity for disaster risk reduction management. So how we can try to understand what are the elements that need to be into consideration when we are planning for disaster risk reduction management at the school level. So for instance, how we develop a contingency plans, how we know what is a reunification plan, which are the drills when we should be doing drills. Why is this important? Why is this important to have a common language when we are trying to manage the school? And it's important to manage disaster risk reduction, you know, not during the whole year, but also it's important to plan for emergency situations. So this is something that we're gonna see on the module number 4. Another objective that we want is to increase the capacity of curriculum developers, teachers and educators to integrate disaster risk reduction education in curricula and in the teaching practices and assessment. So how we really used to mainstream the concept of disaster risk reduction, of resilience, of conflict resolution within the curricula, and how we provide the necessary elements for teachers to really integrate this in their day-to-day courses, and how they can serve for some partnership and cooperation with other sectors that are out of the schools in order to bring this formal education and non-formal education in order that kids understand what is the difference between hazards, what is the difference between disasters, what are the different mechanics that exist in the planet, how a volcano is created, what are earthquakes, what I can do in order to create this culture of resilience that we need and that start from school. So this is very important. The sixth objective that we have is to highlight the importance of multi-hazard assessment for the 3 pillars of the comprehensive school safety framework, and to reinforce the capacities on technical and non-technical tools. And here we're going to have a special focus on one of the methodologies that was launched by UNESCO more than 10 years ago, and that has been applied worldwide in more than 10 countries, and that is continue being applied, that is the VISUS methodology, a multi-hazard assessment method that allowed to give information to the decision makers about where they need to start strengthening the physical capacities of the school. So a special attention will be there. The 7th objective will be to highlight the importance of planning for and during emergencies. So in the times of a specific emergencies, we need to adapt, and we need to adapt quickly. So how we plan for this adaptation in the case of emergencies, how it's important to link this with the planning that we have before, but adapt it to contexts that are particulars, for instance, after a specific disaster, after a specific conflict. So how we plan for these specific cases. And the 8th objective will be to support the development of action plans for the implementation of the comprehensive school safety framework approach. So how we manage to develop action plans in order to implement all these elements that we have been integrated and that we will see during the MOOC. So who is this course aimed at? So of course, this course is aimed to all educational planners, notably, but also to anyone within the education sector and the disaster managed communities who would like to deepen their knowledge on the comprehensive school safety framework. As you know, this is, you're gonna see in the slide, this is how the comprehensive school safety framework has been created. And we're gonna discuss about this, how we arrive to this specific education, comprehensive education framework, how we integrate all the elements that from different point of views, let us know what is school safety. So what you will learn on each module. So as you know, the MOOC is structured around the comprehensive school safety framework and its evolution, and is divided on 8 modules. So this is the 8th module. So one that is going to be talking about the international policy and commitments that we have been agreeing, and we're going to place school safety within that international agenda. The module 2 will introduce the comprehensive school safety framework, but also will introduce some elements of disaster risk reduction and of systemic risk. Module 3 will be talking about the pillar 1 of the comprehensive school safety framework, that is safe learning facilities. Module 4 will be talking about the school disaster management, that is pillar 2 of the framework. Module 5 is going to be talking about disaster risk reduction and resilience education, that is the pillar 3 of the framework. Module 6 will be talking about multi-hazard assessment methodologies, that is one of the foundations of the framework. Module 7 will be talking about planning for education in emergencies, and we will finish in the 8th week with module 8 about action planning for the framework in the country, for implementation of the framework in the country. So a little bit more in detail about the things that we're going to see on each of the modules. So as I say, on module 1, we're going to have an introduction to school safety. We're going to talk about the impacts that we have seen globally and particular in the African region about impacts of different hazards in the education sector. So how natural hazards has impact the education sectors, socio-natural hazards, also conflict, and how these can produce impacts not only on kids, but also on teachers, on infrastructure, and on the education system itself. We're going to be discussing about the school safety, how has been integrated as a key element of the 2030 agendas, notably the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Paris Agreement. So how safe school is a transversal subject that goes on these elements, and that sees that without school safety, we will not reach those targets that we have fixed as the international community by 2030. Then we're going to be discussing about linking the humanitarian and development agenda. So how we need to be sure that the school safety is at the core of the nexus between humanitarian actors and development actors, and the need that they coordinate and work more in a merged way in order that the work of the people that are working on development agendas could incorporate elements of emergency, and of the work of the humanitarian actors could integrate elements and link the humanitarian action for school safety with long-term processes that are established on development agenda, on national development plans, on national education policy, etc., etc. We will finish this module talking about the economic case for safe school. So why is important to invest in school safety, but not just because of the moral issue of being that is important to invest in education, but how we can consider that investing on safe school is a good idea, is a good strategy in order to recover the whole economy. So how we have seen, for instance, with the COVID, that if we would have invested better on securing water and sanitation, good protocols, good internet connections, we would have been even to recover more quickly of COVID than before. So we're going to be discussing about this on the module 1 on module 1.5. The second module will be the introduction to the comprehensive school safety framework. And here we're going to start shaping school safety major related concepts. And we're going to be discussing about, normally the terminology for disaster risk reduction. We're going to be talking about risk, extensive risk, intensive risk, vulnerabilities, hazards, exposure. We're going to be talking about resilience, and we're going to be talking about the different elements that normally we have on disaster risk reduction. Then we're going to introduce the comprehensive school safety framework. We're going to do a generality introduction of what is the CSF, and then we're going to finish off linking the CSF in the context of systemic risk. So in this module, our idea is to try to get a better understanding about how is the planet and how we as societies, we create risk. I love this picture here because it's really very appealing in order to say how societies are creating risk because trying to manage the planet. And we need to try to understand the planet in order to adapt to him and to cope with the different hazards that the planet produces itself. So this is something that we're going to see on the first module. So in that module also, we're going to secure the fact that I was mentioning at the beginning, that disasters are not natural. Disasters are social constructions. And this is something that is very important because when we understand this concept, it's easier for us to plan for something, that to understand that we can really reduce risk, that we can really prevent, that we can really mitigate, and that disasters not happen just because like that. On module number 3, we're going to be discussing about pillar 1 of the CSF. So we're going to see what are the elements for securing school safety, what are some approaches for community-based, what are the different elements that needs to be in place for securing the safety in existing schools. And we're going to see the connections between the pillar 1 with the other 2 pillars of the CSF, with the disaster risk management and with the disaster risk reduction education. So how elements of safe learning facilities overlap with the other 2 pillars. In module number 4, we're going to be talking about the school disaster management. So we're going to identify who are the key partners, roles and responsibilities for disaster management, how we develop a disaster risk management plan, what are standard operating procedures and how we can establish them, what is a contingency planning, and what are the key elements that needs to be in that specific contingency plan. And here we're going to do an overlapping between pillar 2 and pillar 3. What are the elements that overlap between school disaster management and disaster risk reduction education? Then on Module 5, we're going to be discussing more about disaster risk reduction and resilient education. So we're going to be talking about really curriculum, formal education, and non-formal education. So we're going to introduce here good elements that are how we link the school safety agenda and the disaster risk reduction education to a bigger, let's say, chapeau of education subjects, such as the sustainable development and climate change education, which is important because at the end, there is not resilience in schools if we are not able to adapt and if we are not able to sustain development in the long term, and how the choices of development can create new risk or can diminish the risk. Then we're going to be discussing about the different dimensions of disaster risk reduction education, securing the synergies between the education and major educational topics, as I was mentioning, adaptations, sustainability, peace education. Then we're going to have a module 5.4 where we're going to be discussing how to integrate disaster risk reduction into the curricula. So we're going to be talking about the different phases there in order to allow the integration and the different approaches that we have in order to do the integration of DRR into the curricula. And we're going to finish this module discussing about non-formal disaster risk reduction and resilience education. So this education that is out of the school and that is very important in order to better create a culture of safety or resilience in our communities, societies, and countries. Module 6 will be talking about the multi-hazard assessment methodologies. So we're going to be discussing about the multi-hazard approach to safety. We're going to be discussing about the different assessment methodologies, those that are technical, those that are non-technical, the different levels of assessment. So those that are really desktop analysis until those that goes really to a really deep analysis, and that can go in the different pillars. So you can have self-assessments, you can have assessments that are really very based on data that is provided by the schools, when you can have a deeper assessments with specialists that can go and assess the schools, not only the infrastructure, but can assess also the learning outcomes of the education that we are implementing, or can assess the level of quality or the drills that we are developing in the country. So we're going to be talking here about assessment. What are the different assessments? What are the level of assessments? And we're going to introduce, to finalize this module, as I has mentioned at the beginning, the VISUS methodology, one of the key projects and programs that UNESCO has put in place to support ministers of education in order to better understand the vulnerability of their educational facilities and how to take decisions in order to strengthen the physical resilience of schools. Then module 7, we're going to be talking about planning for education in emergency. So we're going to introduce what is emergency response planning in education. We're going to see the foundational standards of education in emergencies, what is important to secure access and learning and to have a learning environment in context of emergencies, in context of conflicts, what is important to take into consideration from learners, for teachers and school staff, how we can secure that, for instance, teachers that has been that are out of the system because of different reasons, how we can replace them, what is important to have at that moment, what is important to plan for them, how we can adapt the curriculum and the learning, so we can, in terms of emergencies or in terms of conflict, we cannot implement the same curricula that we have in normal times. So we need to see how we can adapt and how we can have a blended curriculum, etc., etc. We're going to finish this module talking about some assessing and securing management capacities for planning for education in emergencies. And we're going to finish the MOOC with module number 8, that is action planning for the implementation of the comprehensive school safety framework in the country. So we're going to be talking about the key characteristics and elements that should be reflected in a good plan for school safety. We're going to be discussing about the key phases of the planning process, and we want to finalize this module with the targets and indicators for measuring the implementation of the comprehensive school safety framework. So these targets and indicators that are now a voluntary basis that ministers of education can take, but that are very, very connected to a specific targets, for instance, of SDG 4, of the Sustainable Development Goals, of the Sendai framework, for instance, target D, that is concerning security in facilities, but also the service of education, and other specific targets and indicators that has been agreed and are being implemented by different governments worldwide. So at the end, the idea here is that we can integrate the whole issue of the comprehensive school safety framework that will be in coherence with the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And we understand that school safety is an issue that goes beyond the ministers of education, and that needs to have a repercussion not only on the national plans and strategies for disaster risk reduction, or on the education sector policies and plans that has in the country at different levels, national, regional, local, but also how school safety is an issue that needs to have an influence on other plans, such as the National Development Plan, the National Adaptation Plan, the National Plan for Social Protection and Defense of Children, the sectorial plans for infrastructure, the sectorial plans of water and sanitation, the national health plans. So how school safety is an element that is transversal to the whole elements of planning in a government, of planning in societies, and how we need to enable the environment and coordination elements in order to really secure that when we are implementing school safety actions, we can really secure that our children are okay and that the education system is very resilient. So this is something that we're going to try to finish with this slide, how it's important to integrate the school safety in the whole system approach, understanding the different challenge that social systems and natural systems create, this interaction between both of them, and that create risk, and how we can, through the implementation of school safety, support the reduction of risk, the reduction of vulnerabilities, the increasing of capacities, and at the end, the reduction of risk that we are facing today. So this course, as I mentioned, will introduce the learning to resilience schools and education. It aims to strengthen disaster risk management by providing adequate training on school safety planning and implementation in the context of the commitments of the 2030 Agenda and Systemic Risk. So this is the course that we are launching today. This is the idea that you can understand how school safety really is located in the whole commitments of the 2030 Agenda as a key element in order to reach the targets that we have agreed, and how it's important that we check this school safety in the context of systemic risk. So not in the context of a specific hazard, but in the interconnections that they have between natural, socio-natural, and societal hazards. So for those of you that hasn't been registered yet, so please, I invite you to register. So you can go to the link that is there, that is openlearning.unesco.org. We're gonna put it in the chat. Maybe if my colleague Benito help me to put it in the chat. So for those that hasn't registered yet, please enroll. So you need to enroll here, and then you're gonna start with the course. The course has been launched officially now, has been online since 12 in the night UTC, and is going to be for 8 weeks until 31 August for you to follow in these 2 months, every module per month, per week. Every single module will be composed by videos. So we're gonna be introducing each of the different elements. So we have videos between 20 to 25 minutes for each of the modules. Then we'll have suggested readings, so some readings that we consider that are important also for you to try to understand where are the different elements that are supporting that specific module. And at the end of each module, we're gonna try to include some case studies particular for the Southern African region. So for instance, on the module 1, we will have the cases of Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and South Africa that will be introduced by our colleague, Dr. Wilfred Longlet. And then we finish each module with an assessment that will be sometimes for 20 questions. Sometimes in that assessment, we're gonna ask you also to provide us with some information about how you see that these specific elements that we have seen during the module in your own country, how you see, for instance, what are the elements that has been implemented by your government, what are the hazards that the schools are exposed in your country, etc., etc. And with the assessment, the idea is that every module will provide you with the assessment, and at the end of the 8 modules, if you complete 80% over the 100% of good responses in the assessment, you're gonna get the certificate that is going to be delivered by you by UNESCO on this specific topic. So as I say, the MOOC is ready to start with Module 1. Now we have already uploaded all the elements for Module 1, and you will be able to see it now. So saying this, I officially launched the massive online open course on resilience school and disaster risk reduction education. So I really hope that you will enjoy this MOOC, that you're gonna learn a lot, that you're gonna teach us a lot, and that we together we're gonna build a better understanding about the importance of school safety and the importance of creating resilience education systems in order to secure that our children, but also our societies, will be more resilient and will be ready to reach the targets and compromises that we have set for the 2030 agenda. Thank you for your attention. And now I'm open to any kind of questions that Julia can facilitate for this conversation.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much, Javier, for this very nice introduction to the MOOC, and I think also very attractive introduction. From the chat, I can already see this an immense interest. A lot of people are confirming that they are registering. There were a lot of practical questions, and I think you have replied to most of them. So the length of the MOOC, as Javier just said, is starting from today until the 31st of August, and each week we will cover a module. But maybe also to explain that after that period, the MOOC will be online and it's sort of a self-tutored course, which means other people can register and then go through all the modules, do the exams and finalize the course. The second question was who can register? Everybody basically is the answer. Of course, it is specifically targeted to education planners, planners in the area of disaster risk management, but practitioners are also very much invited. And as Jair said, it has the Southern African flavor because we try to introduce quite a lot of case studies and examples from Southern Africa, but it is definitely also relevant for any other regions. I can see that we have a couple of colleagues from other continents as well, India, for example. Exams, I think Jair replied to that. After each model, you will do an exam. You will have a certificate, which is a UNESCO certificate certifying that you have accomplished that course. Whether I got a couple of questions on whether that helps with applications to UNICEF or the UN system. I can't promise that, but it definitely will help you in your work as an education planner, and you can definitely also list it as a capacity building activity that is worthwhile mentioning. Whether there's practical work within the MOOC, no, because it is an online course, but as Jair said, in that interactive part of the MOOC and also the tests, you will sort of have to reflect on your own context and your own work. So I think that is also very useful. And then I hope I have covered all these sort of very practical questions with regard to the MOOC. And if this is not the case, I would encourage you to, if you can raise your hand. If anybody really has a question with regard on how to register, I had put the link also in the chat. So if you have really practical questions on how to register, because you're now very keen to join the MOOC, please raise your hand and we can help you out quickly. Otherwise,
Julia, if I may, this is Hubert.
Please, Hubert, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah. No, just to add a bit to the discussion and to take it into a broader context. I think we need to see this I could say, quite new approach in a broader context. And I think having worked for over 3 decades in international cooperation, I can see that broader picture. And that is that we need to make a major shift, as I said earlier, from always being at the end of the pipe. I talk in sanitary engineering terms, where you already deal with waste, where you have the problem, where we then become reactive towards moving up in the pipe and be more proactive. And I see that basically as a task for us, and it is a mindset thing, that shift that we need to make from being reactive to becoming proactive. And I see a need for that shift to happen in all aspects of sustainable development. Let me give a few examples. When there is conflict, and we have quite a bit of it here in Africa, we send peacekeepers. And yes, that may be effective to some extent and for some time, but for how long and at what cost? What an immense cost that brings. Why not focus more on peace building, on conflict prevention, on mediation? Another example, gender-based violence. It is being addressed with big programs. We are working on the Spotlight, for instance, with the EU. And we always then focus at the end of the pipe when a woman has become a victim of gender-based violence, and we build shelters and we try to accommodate. So again, that's the responsive approach. And yes, we need to continue to do that, but why not move up in the pipe? And what is there? Well, the point is you need to address men because the gender-based violence issues come from men. So you have to work on masculinities, on behaviors, education, again, awareness raising. So that's, again, the proactive approach. I give another example, HIV. We haven't been able to deal with that yet. There is no cure. There are some medicines available. They are very costly that can somehow keep the virus under control. How much globally of the efforts and now the finance going to HIV goes to prevention, and how much goes to medicines? I would just roughly estimate at least 85–90% of the funding goes to medicines. It's terribly expensive. Again, we're at the end of the pipe. We are reactive. We're not proactive. So move up in the pipe and much more on prevention. And then when I come to disasters, whether it's drought or what, we give food support, a humanitarian response. The whole UN kicks in with massive humanitarian response. And again, I ask, at what cost is this all happening? So this being at the end of the pipe leads to inefficiencies, pushback on SDG achievement, extremely high cost, and eventually no solution that is sustainable. It is always punctual, it is reactive. So I really wanted to place this in a bigger context where we need to move up the pipe and be more proactive and plan. And education is really the response to give. In all these examples that I gave, whether it is conflict and GCE kicks in, global citizenship education, the ESD. I remember I give a very punctual example from my own experience. When I was in Jakarta, we had a big tsunami program on the installation of tsunami early warning. But of course, then the point of having this very expensive technology, it works only if people know what to do when a tsunami strikes. So what we started to do is on the coastal zone, in all the schools, massive training programs, drills, awareness campaigns. And remember, and I think many of you will remember that there was that huge tsunami, I believe it was December 2005 in the Far East. And there was that story from a 9-year-old British, I believe it was a British girl, being on the beach with her family in Thailand. And she had learned about tsunami and how to identify it. That is that the water recedes first and then the big wave comes. And she observed that phenomenon on the coastline, warned her parents, who warned all the others on the beach, and it saved hundreds of people. So you see from this little example how powerful education can be, and if you are prepared, and if you know what to do when things happen. So just thanks for giving me these 3 extra minutes to place this in a broader context. I believe strongly that if we are really committed to achieve the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, we must make that transition and move up the pipe and become more proactive in all these areas, including in disaster management. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hubert, for this important word. So a plea for prevention rather than to reaction to disasters. Just very quickly, and maybe somebody can help me with the exact name. There's always this example of a small town in Japan. It's called the Wonder of Kamaichi, or similar to that, where basically all pupils survived the tsunami, which destroyed the city completely, because they exactly knew what to do and where to run to a sort of upper level meeting point. And it is always cited as an excellent example of disaster risk reduction education saving lives. And I'm sure there are many other examples to give as well. I collected 3 more technical questions for you, Jair. One was whether we are also specifically discussing the vulnerability and work with people with disabilities and learners with disabilities. And I recall there was something in the course as well. The other one was very technical on whether we use GPS, GIS. I have to go back to that comment again when talking about VISs, the latest technologies, including GIS, GNSS, and RS in hazard identification affecting schools, whether that's an area we are looking at. And then there was an abbreviation, and I hope you know it here. GCNC, I think, was the abbreviation, whether we are using that approach as well. Let me look it up.
Don't worry, I'm checking as well for the
Yeah.
question. So now, just to about the different technologies that are going to be applied for the assessments. Yeah, we're gonna mention what are some kind of the technologies that we are using, like GIS, you know, like geological information systems. Like the geospatial information systems. Which one is important, because at the Ministers of Education we need to know where are located our schools, and that allow us to compare the location of the schools with the exposure to different hazards, you know, that are really located, you know, that are local hazards. For instance, coastal hazards for schools that are located in the coast, if we are prone to tsunamis, etc., etc. So yeah, this kind of technology is something that we will mention. Concerning the first questions about education with people with kind of a disability. So yeah, we are integrating this in different modules. So for instance, on module number 2, we're gonna be discussing about vulnerability. And then we're gonna be talking about physical vulnerability, and we're gonna be talking about social vulnerabilities and individual vulnerabilities. So we're gonna see how it is important that we, at the school level, also plan, you know, taking into consideration the diversity of our students and the needs that each one of them has to react. Because one of the ideas is to increase the response capabilities of our students in the case of a specific emergency. So we're gonna be discussing this. We are not going directly deep in the subject. We're gonna share with you some videos, some reading for those that are more interested on that area. We're gonna mention it. We're gonna put it there in the planning cycle. But if you want further reading, is going to be provided for you on this element. And I just want to complement what Professor Huber has mentioned. I think that he make a valuable comment is the idea with all this massive online, open online course on school safety is really to try to move the agenda on changing, on shifting from the post even reaction to a more proactive action. There are many studies already that has been suggesting, there is an evidence suggesting that every single dollar that we invest on mitigation, protection, prevention, preparation, early warning, before any hazard occur, save up to $7 to $21 on the response and reconstruction. So it's more costly efficient to invest now on school safety and disaster risk reduction education than to wait for the events to start investing on that. And this is something that at the ministers of education, but also in general, the whole government, we need to understand, because it's very important that we start investing now, because the benefits of education, the benefits of school safety, but also the benefits to the whole society. One of the issues that we have been realizing on this, for instance, is that one of the first signs to say that we have passed from the response to the recovery phase of the disaster cycle. So when we are not more in the emergency itself, but we are already seeing what happened and how we can start the rehabilitation, reconstruction, and recovery, is when kids can go to school. Because when schools are open, normally parents can bring their kids to schools. They feel safe, they feel confident that the kids gonna be all right, and then they can go back to their jobs and they can go to their enterprises and start seeing like, okay, now how I'm gonna solve the problems that were created by this specific event. So investing in some school safety is a good element, because that is the first element that needs to be open when we are talking about recovery. If schools are not open, parents, don't have the time to take into consideration other aspects of the recovering processes, like recovering their business, recovering their house, etc., etc. So school safety and disaster reduction education is a key element to secure that we are creating resilient societies. I don't know if Julia, if we have another question.
Yes, I think 2 more questions, and then I think we'll have to close the session. It's not end of the discussion. Whoever is registering for the course will have the opportunity to continue this discussion with us for the next 9 weeks. So one, again, coming back to that abbreviation, will you be making the connection with conflict-related school safety and the work of GCPEA? I'm not sure whether you know which organization.
This is the Global Coalition for Education Under Attack. So yes, why? Because as I was mentioned at the beginning, before Sendai, that was the Hyogo Framework for Actions. The Hyogo Framework for Actions was very explicit that we're going to be discussing only about natural hazards and socio-natural hazards. So those hazards that have this kind of relation between the human interaction, but with the nature, like climate change. Okay. When the Sendai framework started, we start discussing in the Sendai framework about the all hazards approach. And this all hazards approach also includes some elements about societal hazards, migration, conflict. And now there was a good discussion that was taking place at the technical level in order to see like, okay, what hazards are included in Sendai. And we're going to be discussing about this when we discuss the subject of hazards. There are 8 clusters that has been identified as the major hazard clusters, which includes hydrometeorological hazards, geological hazards, biological hazards like COVID, technological hazards, chemical hazards, extraterrestrial hazards that you say like, well, okay, the Armageddon, well, we have a lot of satellites there that could affect us, and also societal hazards that include conflict, that include migration, and that are elements that we need to include in our planning processes there. So yeah, we're going to be talking about the Global Coalition as one of the coalitions that has been created in the architecture for safe schools. Of course, we're going to be most of the elements are based on natural, socio-natural hazards, but the integration of conflict and migrations and other elements that generate issues on the safety of kids will be discussed during the whole course.
Yeah, thank you very much, Javier. So last comment was on, or the last comment we are taking now was on whether there's a possibility to give feedback. And I think you had mentioned that already, Javier, that some of the questions also following the models will be on your specific content and therefore also how relevant modules are for your content, because we of course appreciate feedback and also in order to improve the course on the long term. But you can also always contact us directly, all the facilitators, including Javier and myself, And we definitely, of course, would appreciate feedback. So I'm afraid I will have to stop now. It was an extremely interesting session, and I can see from the chat I did not manage to reply to all of you. Some of my replies are very short, so I apologize for that. But as I said, you can always write to Jair or myself directly if you have further questions. And we are really looking forward to our interactions over the next 8 weeks during the course. Please join us. All the best. Thank you very much for Jair for that excellent presentation and replies to the many questions. And thank you very much, Hubert, for helping us to open and launch the course. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye and thank you.